Well, we're going to talk about evil, okay? And we talked about this a bit last night, talking about death, okay? And the way, let me put it this way. Some would see the natural conclusion of some of the things that we just pointed out as existing last night in the form of horrendous ways to die as evidence that Christianity just isn't true. They would say, well, all that happened, so you should not be a Christian. It is irrational for you to be a Christian. It is irrational for you to believe in God, specifically in the Christian one, and that is how the conclusion that they would draw from just the existence, the fact of such things happening in the world. This is usually called the problem of evil. And the title of this, which is the only title that I think makes any kind of sense, I'm kind of like Pastor Lewis. I hate titling things. If I can help it, I just title it. I'm glad. I can't stand it. I can't stand it. But I think this one kind of nails it, which is evil. Whose problem is it anyways? And what I want to show you by the end of it is that the problem of evil is not a problem for the Christian. In fact, for the Christian, it is one of the strongest evidences for Christianity. Rather, evil is a problem for everyone else. Their worldviews cannot resolve it. The Christian worldview can. So, the so-called problem of evil has long stood as the final nail in the coffin that many bury their faith in. We're going to look at just a few of different versions of this problem. I sent it to you in a follow-up email on the same email thread. Yep. So we're going to look at a few of these, see whether they provide any real justification for unbelief. Now, each of these arguments is designed to provide what is called a defeater for Christian theism. So a defeater would be a claim that, if it were true, would generate a contradiction with the claim it's defeating. So if I could demonstrate, if there were two claims out there, one is that Seth is sitting in that chair, and the other is that Seth is sitting in that chair, if I can provide sufficient evidence that he's actually sitting in this chair, it would defeat the other claim. It would generate that contradiction. If I can prove one. Because claims like that don't exist in vacuums. They have supporting evidence, supporting arguments. So when someone just says, well, I don't believe God exists, so he doesn't exist, that's not rational to just, well, I already believe it, therefore it's true. They have to provide evidence and argument. And so two contradictory claims, the one that actually can be proven is the one that is true. Seems obvious, and it should be, I hope. But if a defeater is put forth, then you would be irrational to believe both things at the same time. And so the person putting forth the problem of evil is trying to say, if you believe evil exists, and you should, then Christianity cannot be true. So what are some of these problems of evil? They take the form of different kinds of syllogisms. Syllogisms, to give you a brief, again, logic primer here, are just steps in an argument. If this, then that, therefore this. If it's cold outside, then I will be cold if I'm outside. I'm outside, therefore I'm cold. That's kind of how they run. It's the way that we all think, we just don't formalize it. So when someone is formalizing their argument, they often will put it into a syllogism, and it sounds awkward and weird to us, kind of unnatural to our ears, but this is actually the way that we often all think about things. And we go from point A to point B to point C. So the first is the very popular logical problem of evil. And what it attempts to do is to generate this contradiction in very formal terms. was popularized by the philosopher David Hume a couple centuries ago. And it goes something like this. If God exists and is omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omnipresent, then evil would not exist. And let me define those terms for you, if you're unfamiliar with them. If God exists and is omnipotent, has all power, omnibenevolent is all good, and is omnipresent, is everywhere, at all times, then evil would not exist. Because if he has the power to stop it, is there to stop it, and is good, he would stop it, then there would be no evil. But, premise 2, evil does exist. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, his logical problem, what it tries to do, is to take the attributes of God and set them against each other. And try to force the Christian into a dilemma. You either deny one of the omni-attributes, or you deny the existence of evil, somehow, or you deny that God exists. Those are your supposed options presented to you. Is that, well, if God could stop it, then maybe he just doesn't stop it. So maybe he's not all good. He's just as good as he's good sometimes. Or maybe God isn't all-powerful. Maybe he just can't stop it. Or maybe he's not omnipresent. Maybe he's not omniscient. Maybe that's how you get around it, is you just say, well, he doesn't really know everything. So he doesn't know that evil is going to happen before it happens. So he just can't stop it. These are ways in which people try to get around it. Many heresies have arisen as a result of this argument. People trying to respond to it and failing to do so by compromising one of God's attributes. Now, I'm not going to give you all the answers to these problems yet. I want you to sit with them a bit as I go through them, when you see how multifaceted the problem is, and then we'll get to the Christian response. The next one is what I call the evidential problem of evil. This one, you'll notice, now that you have the notes, doesn't have a syllogism. It doesn't have point 1, 2, 3. And that's because this never does. This is the one that most people are actually using to deny Christianity. This is usually the real problem, which I phrase it this way. The obvious evil of my experience means that the God of Christianity must not exist. Because if he did, he would stop all of the evil that happens to me. And this is a combination of some of the stuff we've talked about all week, kind of culminating in this person's reasoning, where they believe that they're inherently a good person. If God existed and loved them, then nothing bad would ever happen to them. And so if anything bad happens to them, God must not exist. And so they're using the evidence of evil in their life, the experience of evil. We maybe could better term this experiential problem of evil, or the existential problem of evil, that their existence in a world where evil happens to them is leading them away from believing in God. Then we have the argument from pointless evil. So this is kind of a softening of the logical problem of evil, where someone might say, maybe some of the arguments that have been given against the logical problem, maybe those work a little bit. So let me soften that, make it a little less strong, and say, if the Christian God exists, then there might be some evil, but there would be no pointless evil, evil that serves no purpose. That's one of the ways that theologians through the centuries have responded to the problem of evil, is to say that God has a purpose in it. And so the atheists and the anti-Christian arguers have responded to that by saying, but there's pointless evil out there. There's evil that I can't conceive of in my own imagination any purpose for this. or I don't see a purpose for it historically. And so surely it's pointless. And so surely God does not exist. Or another softening, so to speak, of the argument is horrendous evil. If the Christian God exists, there might be evil, but it would not ever be on the scale that we see it. Horrendous evils like the Holocaust, or Stalin's Russia, or crusades, or school shootings, or pick your horrific thing that happens. Premise 2, there are horrendous evils, therefore God does not exist. And then there's the argument from natural suffering. If the Christian God exists, then he would not allow natural suffering. So maybe there would be evil committed by people. So maybe they'll accept something like a free will argument against the normal problem of evil, kind of that first one that we lined out. And they'll say, well, God gave humans freedom, and so evil. All right, says the arguer, but what about natural suffering? Sometimes they'll call it natural evil. I change it to suffering to clarify the term. But suffering caused by natural disasters, hurricanes, animal attacks, buildings, bridges collapsing, all of these different things that could just happen to anyone at the spur of a moment. Surely, if God existed and he's good and powerful and everywhere and knows all things, then he would not allow these things to happen. But natural suffering does exist, so God must not exist. And then finally, we have innocent suffering. If the Christian God exists, then we might expect evildoers to suffer. We might expect the wicked to have evil done to them or suffering to happen to them, but not innocent people, not children or babies. Yet they do suffer. Some are murdered. Some have, and to some, even more horrible things happen to them. And so, God must not exist. Surely he would not allow the innocent to suffer, right? Says the non-Christian. Now, I want you to notice, as we begin thinking through our own response to this, let me introduce you to another $5 phrase. Arbitrary, prejudicial conjecture, or an APC. Now, if you play, military shooter type games, you may be familiar with that term as an armored personnel carrier. It's the big trucks that carry guys into combat. And so you maybe could call it a armored prejudice carrier. That might help you remember it better. And that's often what is happening in all of these arguments. There is an arbitrary idea that is imported into one's worldview. For example, they have no reason biblically to think that if the Christian God exists, all of these things would be the case. They are arbitrarily deciding that this would be the case. They're not even considering the biblical data about who God is. They're just taking an abstraction of God and going, well, if good is an attribute of God, goodness, if power is, but they don't define those things, they just kind of pick and choose what they think it means that fits their argument. It's arbitrary. It's prejudiced. They're not coming at this from an honest perspective. They already have basically decided that God can't exist from the outset. And this is the retroactive justification. Like I said, usually the experiential problem of evil, or the evidential one, is the driver into the syllogistic versions. That's what that's what it takes a form of. And then it's a conjecture. It's all conjectural. It's just, well, surely, based upon my own reasoning, this, and this would all have to be the case. And so they create these arbitrary prejudicial conjectures, and they import them into their worldview, and the result is unbelief. And if you can recognize those when they're happening, they don't just happen in the problem of evil. Every single unbelieving thought system we've considered this week all have those at the foundation. Their first principles are APCs because they have no way to give an account for them. they have no way to justify them. If their worldview that they built on top of it is true, the foundation would fall apart. Their house has been built upon sand. So, part of our Christian response is going to be pointing all of this out in different ways from different angles. So first, we as Christians must define evil. What is it? Notice, that's never given. It's just kind of assumed based on our experience that we just kind of know what this is. We all just feel the weight of evil in the world. And so the arguments are thrown about and nobody ever bothers to ask the question, hey, what is evil in the first place? Evil is any act that violates God's law word. Done. In other words, sin. This precludes God from being involved in actual evil actions because he can't go against himself. So this is important when you hear other arguments that are kind of adjacent to this one, where people will say that the God of the Bible is evil. Now, wait a second. Define your terms. God cannot be evil by definition. This also means that evil cannot be merely the absence of goodness. It's a privation theory of evil, popularized by theologian Augustine. You don't need to know all of that, but that's where it comes from. Because evil requires positive actions to take place. They're real things that are done toward people or toward God by people. And so it cannot be mere privation or mere absence of goodness or mere twisting of the good. There's an actual definition to it. Murder is a thing that is done to someone. For example, this also means that natural suffering is not evil in itself, but a result of the evil of the fall and the judgment that came upon us from God. In the cursing of Adam, all of creation was cursed in him. Which is why I gave you a bit of a head start there by defining those problems not as natural evil, but natural suffering. So we have to get our definitions squared away. And then we need, on the heels of that, which part of that is, the next thing is part of the last one, where we're remembering what the fall meant for everyone. We remember Genesis 1-3. Foundational chapters of the Bible. Foundational principles of your Christian worldview. We must remember that God created the world good. And that God is the standard of goodness and righteousness. We must remember that we, humanity, brought evil into the world. And God is right and just to bring judgment and cursings upon us for our evil. We have to remember that none of us are good. And so none of us deserve anything but the righteous judgment from God in death. The fact that God does not slay us where we stand, but showers us with mercy, not just with another day of breath and life that we so often use to sin against him, but with actual peace and righteousness as a gift through Jesus Christ, should astound us every day. What we deserve is judgment. What we often get is grace. We are the problem with the world, and God is our solution. Next, remember, it is not your problem. The non-Christian cannot give that previous accounting for evil from Genesis or a definition that is intelligible. He can't do it. Evil for him is just what feels yucky. Well, when people do that, that doesn't make me feel good. Well, the murderer might feel good when he's murdering people, so that doesn't help you define evil. Just because you don't like what he's doing doesn't make it always wrong or evil. They might feel rightly about evil, though, knowing that it is bad and natural. But again, their own system cannot account for its existence as always wrong, at all times, all places, for all people. without God as the standard of goodness, and without God revealing how evil comes about and the solution to it, the non-Christian has a deeper problem than he believes the Christian has. Because the problem of evil for him is that he can't account for it. He can't tell you why it's bad. He can't tell you why he should feel bad about it. He can't tell you why anyone should do anything about it. For him, it's just a matter of utility or pragmatism. Well, we don't get along as well as a society if everybody's killing each other. Okay. Who says we should get along well as a society? Why is that a good thing? Asking those questions will help you engaging with non-Christian thought. They can't give answers to those kinds of questions. Not that are intelligible anyway. We need to remember logic and what it is and where it's grounded. Each argument that I gave to you depends upon logical laws to establish a contradiction within the Christian worldview. But remember, any attempt to establish a contradiction in the Christian worldview always would undermine itself. Because in order for those logical laws to exist, in order for us to know about them, in order for them to be coherent and actually describe the world around us properly, the Christian God must exist. He is the source of all truth. He is the grounding of all reality. He is prime reality. Logic is not an abstraction that exists in some weird place in space, but is a reflection of God's mind and is the order that He has established in His creation. So any attempt to argue through logical argument against God defeats itself, because it must assume that God exists from the start in order to get off the ground. Next, we must remember who God is, the sovereign king, and remember who you are. You are dust, or a chicken nugget, as I like to say. God's response to Job in Job 40-42 is how God answers us in many ways when we come to challenge Him about His governance of reality. We cannot try to create philosophical categories to defend God when it comes to the subject, nor appeal to anything that would undermine His sovereignty over His creation in order to soften the reality of evil. And let me just flip to Job for a moment and read to you some of the things that he says. Sorry, I put 40-42. It starts in chapter 38. I was typing that one in a half-awake state and forgot the chapter ranges and didn't look them up. God begins his answer to Job, speaking out of the whirlwind, as it says in verse 1. And he says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" And this, all the way up to this part in the book, Job and his friends have been going back and forth in this dialogue about who God is and how God should act in regard to Job's situation. God continues, "Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me." So he's kind of being sarcastic a little bit here. Since it's like, well, if you know so much, Job, I will ask you hard questions. You've been asking me hard questions, I'm going to ask you some hard questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who enclosed the sea with doors when bursting forth it went out from the womb? When I made a cloud its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and I placed boundaries on it and set a bolt and doors. And I said, thus far you shall come, but no farther, and here shall your proud waves stop. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, that I may take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? So you notice, what is God saying here? He's asking Job, have you created everything? Who do you think you are? And who do you think I am? That's what, and he goes on and on about this. And then the beginning of chapter 40 is important, where Job interjects for a moment. It says, Then the Lord said to Job, Will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, I will not answer, even twice, and I will add nothing more. And then God keeps going and going. And finally, Job concludes, and he answers God back in chapter 42. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Talking about himself. Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. He's quoting God again. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes. The solution to evil for the Christian is to know God. That's what we learn from this. If you know God, not just abstractly, not just in His attributes, but you know Him through the mercy of Jesus Christ, then you understand your place and His. You're not the main character. And so, the world doesn't always just hand you what you want on a silver platter. You're not the author of the story. You don't know better. God does. Will you instruct God as to how He should run the world? Will you tell Him, I can do it better? Or will you know your place in the cosmos? You are dust. God is king. You are creation. God is creator. Cornelius Van Til, another theologian, he says regarding this, in His inscrutable will, God has planned the reality of sin for the revelation of His glory. To say that God only permitted evil and has not planned it is only a fruitless attempt to justify Him by our own logic, because further thought cannot resist the idea of a permission of evil by one who could prevent it. So he's hearkening back to that first problem of evil. God does not need our little fences for His protection, nor do they do us much subjective good, but rather harm. We see this throughout Job's dialogue. Job really is the book about this subject. If you remember what happens to Job, he suffers greatly at the hands of natural suffering and actual evil. His bandits who come and plunder his household at one point. His own wife curses him. He doesn't just suffer natural suffering, but also actual evil. And yet the conclusion of that book, God does not give him justifications or excuses or, well, I was just respecting this thing or that thing, or I was just doing, I was just, I was playing 3D chess with Satan. Like, he doesn't say any of that. Instead, he says, I am the creator. You are creation. Get to know me, and you'll understand. And then Job concludes, I had only heard about you by the ear, but now I see you. I know you. I retract everything I said. I have no answer. We must remember two more things. That the sinner is also a sufferer. We must show compassion to the person who is denying God on the basis of evil. Often, again, the intellectual arguments, all the syllogisms, all the logic, is a smoke screen for an emotional one based upon something truly terrible that has happened to them. Tell them the truth in love and show sympathy for their plight. Greg Bahnsen says, therefore, it should not be thought that the problem of evil is anything like an intellectual basis for a lack of faith in God. It is rather simply the personal expression of such a lack of faith. They already didn't trust God, and that's why they're having a hard time with evil. They had heard of Him with the ear, but they did not know Him the way they ought to have. Finally, remember the gospel. As R.C. Sproul once said, and Pastor Lewis quoted this, I think, last Sunday, Why do bad things happen to good people? That only happened once, and he volunteered. When we have biblical categories for sin, evil, humanity, God, all those things, this is not our greatest problem. This is one of our greatest strengths. This objection to the Christian faith is the easiest for us, mid-conversation, to turn toward the gospel. Evil is a reality that is not resolved through intellectual arguments, as Job and his friends were trying to do, but rather through the God who made all things by his own hands, subjecting himself to evil at the hands of his own creation. By plunging himself into death and darkness, God shows us his purpose, plan, and majesty, even in the face of horrendous evil. Because what is the most evil event that has ever happened in the world but the crucifixion and murder of the Son of God at the hands of his own creation? He fashioned the tree upon which he was crucified. He formed and shaped the hands and the womb of the soldiers who nailed him to the cross. If he did that, knowing what would happen full well, and put himself through it anyway, then we can trust him when we suffer evil, when we suffer natural suffering. The real problem of evil in the world is that we are evil ourselves and need God to rescue us from our sin and to give us peace with him. Much more can always be said, but there you go, a little introductory primer to a very, many would say difficult problem, but I think is, again, one of our best ways to just share the gospel with people. Give them an answer to evil.